everyone, and welcome back to the Big Political Questions podcast, or BPQs pod for short. My name is Natalia Prucnal, and this is my co-host, Charlie Gell.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Big Political Questions. This is obviously where we're going to be debating the great issues of our time, obviously relating to the Edexcel A Level Spec. We've enjoyed recording the last couple of episodes. The support has been great. So today we're looking back at Unit 1. And before we obviously get into today's Big Political Question, we usually do like a icebreaker example thing beforehand. So today we're going to be looking at referendums, and that's going to be relating to our Big Political Question, the great issue of our time. So what is a referendum? So a referendum is usually a yes or no singular vote. Can't really be sorted out by our representatives. It's usually a massive divisive political issue, usually very big changes, for most parts constitutional change, usually a policy proposal. As I say, it can't really be fixed by a politician, so they send it to the people to vote on. And they are a form of direct democracy. You know, it's the individual stepping foot into Westminster themselves, not literally, but in a metaphorical sense, and hoping to sort a big issue. So if we look at recent examples, you know, the big one would be Brexit, the EU referendum, leave or remain. It was obviously pretty much 50-50. Referendums in more recent times have become more common, but Taz, would you like to look at the history of referendums, perhaps?
So before 1997 being when Tony Blair was elected and introduced his new Labour policies, there was not many referendums happening. However, he introduced more and kind of encouraged more to happen. So the general ones that he introduced were the devolution referendums, and this encouraged more people to become engaged within politics, and it encouraged people to start discussing main and important social and political problems. So it definitely has helped people become a part of the things that have affected the UK and have definitely allowed people to choose their own future for the country.
So I was actually listening to Blair talking on Newsnight recently, and he was talking about, you know, these referendums. One of the great things about New Labour that he wanted to do was make Westminster and UK politics more democratic. With the Scottish referendum especially, it was a big gamble for him because, you know, yes, it could either kick off an independence movement, or it could actually make Scotland content with the power they were about to be given. You know, I think everyone knew that Scotland were going to overwhelmingly vote yes to get more power, because why wouldn't you want more power in your local area? Obviously, we know now that it kind of did kick off an independence campaign as we see the rise of the SNP. Perhaps the SNP is about to fall, but that's perhaps another big political question, not related to the Edexcel spec. But, you know, Blair's referendums, no matter what your opinions are on Blair, are actually quite commendable. I mean, we look at the Good Friday Agreement, especially, very momentous thing for the UK, especially with the Troubles and Northern Ireland finally beginning its peace process. So we're going to move on now to today's big political question. I've had enough of commending Tony Blair, and I think we pretty much know what referendums are. It's a very easy thing to explain, very easy thing to understand. So Natalia's going to be arguing, as always, the yes side. I, as always, am going to be the great pessimist and argue the no side. So, Taz, what is today's big political question?
Today's big political question is, to what extent do referendums strengthen democracy?
So, Natalia, what would your first point be on why referendums do actually strengthen democracy?
Yeah, so my first point for why they do actually strengthen democracy is because they encourage the public to give their own views on policy, which are then reflected in the aftermath of the referendum. An example of this is in 1997, which is the Scottish devolution referendums, and it had a 60% voter turnout for both, and 74% of people voted that there should be a Scottish Parliament. 64% voted for the Scottish Parliament to have taxation powers. So this does show that a lot of people did deem it as advantageous for Scotland to have devolved powers and more control over itself and its autonomy. So it really does suggest that referendums allow the public to voice their opinions on certain topics that affect them directly, and then they are followed through, which allows people to have more trust within politics as well, because they are able to demonstrate their own view. And this helps to enforce democracy, as there is a more direct approach.
So I said before, I'm going to be looking at the other side. So my disagree point, firstly, would be that referendums do not strengthen democracy much because they do not always have a high turnout that reflects the nation as a whole. An example of where we've seen a low voter turnout would be in the 1998 Greater London Authority election. This is where London would have been devoluted its own legislature, much like Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. They'd have one person and a council around him making the laws and rules for London. So this is something that you would consider important. You could say constitutional change in London alone. So you'd expect a higher voter turnout, especially, today there's nearly 9 million people in London, I think anyway. But back then you could say, okay, 6 million people. So it's still a large amount of people that you'd expect to be voting. Of them adults, I'd imagine there's around 4 million. So, but the voter turnout was quite low. It was 34%. 72% of them voted yes for the GLA. But it kind of gives it a lack of, I'd say, legitimacy with the low voter turnout, no? People would say that this doesn't reflect accurately the opinion of London on a whole. And this could be due to the low voter turnout. Could be due to people not caring, or the referendum maybe not being well publicised. Maybe people didn't even know there was a referendum vote. And this basically highlights my point that referendums don't always have strong outcomes. This would for me show how referendums could be seen as undemocratic, showing how they do not support or enforce democracy, especially not direct democracy by any means. But that would be my counter to Tows's first point. So Natalia, what would your second point be on why perhaps referendums do actually strengthen our democracy?
So my second point in regards to it being democratic is that it allows the public to become educated on certain topics and issues at the time, and it allows people to make better informed decisions than they would have prior to the referendum. So an example would be the 2016 Brexit referendum, which I'm sure everyone already knows about. This is when the UK was planning to leave the European Union, and this allowed the parties to have their campaigns for both leave and remain. So especially the Conservative Party, they were quite divided on this topic, with a lot of politicians choosing to campaign for Remain and a lot of politicians choosing to campaign for Leave. And this allowed voters to see the possibilities and possible consequences of both sides of the argument. And this allowed them to become more politically literate and make their own conclusions and decisions when it came to voting. So this also allowed people to build up their beliefs and have that more closely reflect their actual vote in the outcome. So the referendum turnout was 72%, meaning people felt quite passionately about this, whether they were voting Leave or Remain. People really did feel a connection with this referendum in particular, and 52% voted Leave. So it does show that it's evident that through campaigns, people were able to choose whether they wanted to change EU and UK politics and EU and UK trade, and it helped people understand the concept better. So therefore, referendums do allow for an improved democratic process, as they encourage political literacy and encourage more people to vote and take part in the political process.
Okay, so if I'm going to look at the other side to Natalia's point there, very strong point, I must add, I would say conversely, referendums are not fully capable of teaching the public these important things, as some campaigns may mislead people or encourage a false narrative. We've seen this very recently in the Brexit referendum, famously the big red bus, where they said that, let's leave the EU, get £350 million more a week. In actuality, yes, we were paying, and then put it into our NHS. So in actuality, if you divided the amount we were paying the EU a year, it was £350 million a week, but we weren't actually paying the EU £350 million a week. So these things are misleading. I believe there was a statistic about £4,000 extra for your household a week if we stayed in the EU. So there's misleading things on both sides. And see, when you're making such constitutional decisions, you want as much honesty, integrity and transparency as possible, because these are big issues that they've put to the public. Additionally, there have been 2.8 million signatures, as we saw in the first episode of Big Political Questions, and the second referendum petition. So these misleading things can lead to very, very narrow results that, you could say aren't actually a true representation of what the country wants. Perhaps people say that, I would say it's pretty much an objective fact. If we voted today to leave the EU, we we wouldn't have. We would have voted to remain after we've seen what's happened with the whole Brexit process. It was evident in the actual referendum result. 52% voted leave, but also 48% voted remain. So that's a whole, pretty much half of the nation, half of the 70 million people, including Scotland and Northern Ireland, which both voted substantially to remain, being completely disregarded. So this therefore shows that referendums are not the best way to support democracy, as not all the campaigns are truthful. I would say all the campaigns are full of some deceit and some things that are misleading, but this is how politics is. It's a very toxic environment a lot of the time. And not all of these conclusive decisions are supported by, a large amount of people. As I said, 48% of people didn't support Brexit, but they were told they had to go through with it anyway. So, Natalia, what would your third and final point be on why referendums do actually strengthen democracy?
So my third and final point is that referendums are democratic as they ensure that there is a check on the government's power, as the government is not the one making massive nation-altering decisions. So an example of this would be in 2011, where there was a referendum on changing the first past the post system to alternative voting, so FPTP to AV. However, the outcome was a 68% no, which is important as it means that people were not actually interested in changing the voting system. If the government had voted, it is likely that the outcome would have been the same, as MPs want to remain being voted in through a certain system, as their ability to be voted in may be minimized. And so they would probably also vote for yes. However, it's good that we actually had the choice on that rather than the MPs having to choose for themselves, as it would not accurately represent everyone's voice and it would be unfair as they're already being voted in through this system. This also keeps the government to account as it ensures that everyone has the ability to vote on major topics and it's not just a small selection pool. So within the House of Commons, we have 650 people. So that's a massive minority of people of the UK in comparison to the millions of people who are living here. So it's important that we have the ability to vote on important topics like that, as it allows the government to be held to account and not just having those 650 people constantly represent the nation's voice. So therefore, referendums do a good job at being democratic as they provide a check on the executive's power.
Totally. I think that's a very strong point, probably the strongest point out of your three there. So it's going to be quite hard to counter. But
I wrote all of these, by the way, so Charlie's not being particularly nice about this.
Yeah, so my third and final opposing point would be that referendums are actually only advisory. I didn't actually realize this until recently. Just a quick little story for you here. My law teacher decided not to be very democratic, and he said to us, "Would you rather the test be Friday or tomorrow?" Whole class said Friday except from one. And he goes, okay. End of the lesson, he goes to us, "Right, so the test is going to be tomorrow, guys." I'm like, "Sir, you're not really representing the will of the people here. We've all just voted for Friday." And he went, "Yeah, but referendums are only advisory." So I looked into it, and that actually is the case. And we have seen this in our system. The second ever referendum that we had in the United Kingdom was the 1979 Scottish devolution referendum. The electorate overwhelmingly voted for yes, we want more power. We want Scotland to be devoluted power from Westminster. However, the government set a threshold where the yes turnout had to be 40% for the actual for the actual devolution to be carried out, and that threshold wasn't met. So yes, it was an advisory. Scotland wants more power, but it wasn't granted to them. So referendums can be ignored by representatives. This further shows how referendums are actually undemocratic and they don't strengthen democracy.
See, that was quite a good counter argument, because even though governments can be held to account, there is the notion that they are just advisory and the governments don't have to actually follow through with the results of it and whatnot. So that is a good point. So Charlie, will you move us into the conclusion? Of course, as always, if you don't agree with our conclusion, that's fine. It's our opinion. We think that this is the stronger point to argue. However, if you choose to conclude the other side of the point, then that is completely fine. That is up to you. So Charlie, what is our conclusion?
So we've concluded that overall, it is more accurate to say that referendums do actually strengthen democracy and they strengthen the democratic process. If we were going to, strengthen it further, we could perhaps make referendums more honest. Honest campaigns are needed. We need transparency, integrity to really give people the clearest set of options when voting in a referendum. Um, voter turnout should also be encouraged. Maybe not put stipulations on whether, decisions are going to be made, because it kind of undermines the democratic process. But yeah, we should encourage more voter turnout. But I think that is more of a general thing. People should be voting. You can't complain about something happening if you didn't raise your voice in that particular issue.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that we shouldn't have maybe this is obviously I'm just bringing my own personal opinion into this now, but we shouldn't have the rule that everyone has to vote, or that it's against the law to not vote or avoid voting. I think that that's a bit overkill, but I do think that we should generally encourage people to start voting and having their voice heard, so that there isn't the argument that, oh, well, something happened and I didn't agree with it. Well, if you didn't vote, then you know what I'm saying. So there is the situation where it should be encouraged, but it should not be forced.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
yeah.
people are less likely to actually want to. So we'll move on to a little task. Of course, now the essay aspect of this video is over. However, we will have a little talk about something based on referendums, and the task that we've proposed today. Charlie, would you like to read it out?
So today's task or activity is, if you could introduce a referendum now, what questions would you propose? Now, obviously, me and Natalia are going to be giving our answer to that, but also this is a task for the listeners as well. We'd like to see what referendums you'd like to see in the UK, what you'd like to be voting on, and perhaps we could do a debate on your choices, perhaps maybe in a BPQs extra episode or something like that. But yeah, so Natalia, if you could introduce a referendum now, what question would you be proposing?
Okay. I if I'm being completely honest, I think it's a little bit too late to do a Brexit redo. I think
Yeah, I agree.
we're too far into it now. So now it's been 7 years since the referendum and 3 years since we've left the EU. I think it's a little bit late to do something like that now. Okay. We discussed this in one of the BPQs extras episode, and this is on votes at 16. I would probably do one for votes at 16 or votes at 17. Votes at 17 if we're not trying to be too radical. But probably votes at 17, possibly lowering voting age to 17 or lowering voting age to 16 across the nation. Or my other one, I would probably do another Scottish independence referendum. I think there's
We
enough.
asked for one, Natalia.
Listen, I'll explain
This is
why.
the United Kingdom.
So I'll explain why, right? So people in Scotland have clearly grown and developed a passion for their independence, despite it being rejected previously and despite them voting in a referendum that they don't want to leave. There is a rising population of people who do want to, and you did mention at the start of this episode about how the SNP could be on a downfall possibly, but I do think that will not erase the strength and the power that people feel when they fight for their independence. So that's what I would argue. Would I probably propose that first in comparison to votes at 16? Probably, because then people who are 16, if this passes, this is my logical thinking, right? So if the votes at 16 passes and people agree on that, people who are 16 will then be able to vote for the future of Scotland, and it wouldn't just be people over 65 who will also have the chance to vote, but they won't be the ones living in the newly reformed Scotland as long as the younger generations.
I disagree with both of them, to be honest.
Fair enough.
But I don't want to be boring and say that I would do the other one in the last BPQs episode, but it would probably be voting reform again. This time I would certainly be doing something that's more publicised, because the AV referendum is another referendum which had a low turnout. People didn't really know that there was a referendum. They put it in the same day as the local elections. So it'd probably be one of voting reform. We need a more proportional and a more representative Westminster that can still retain a strong government, a strong one-party government, hopefully. But that's the only one that really springs to mind. We see big things that are mentioned in pretty much every single manifesto. Issues like lower taxation, issues like strengthening immigration, perhaps we could bring a referendum in where we say, I don't know, yes or no on whether you want to, okay, divisive issues of our day. We have things like the Rwanda policy. We could perhaps have a referendum on how strong we want to be on hardline immigration, or how soft we want to be on hardline immigration, because these are issues that people constantly saying they want, but they're not being delivered. So, and they are very divisive, pretty much as divisive as Brexit was. But my main one would be voting reform. Um, but I can't really think of any other questions that really spring to mind. I'm not really the biggest fan of referendums. One, because I feel like it divides people too much. And secondly, I think, it's taking accountability away from our politicians, as we vote our representatives to be dealing with these issues for us. We don't live in a direct democracy, live in a representative function. So why are we the ones that are making these decisions?
I do agree with quite a lot of that, actually. I think there are a lot of divisive issues that are not discussed within referendums. But at the same time, I think not everyone will have their voice heard in terms of, you mentioned the Rwanda policy, right? I'm sure there are Conservative Party members that don't agree with that policy, and there are Labour Party members that don't agree with that
I mean,
policy.
high profile politicians in the Conservative Party, ex-prime ministers like Theresa May doesn't agree with the Rwanda policy. So yeah, it's definitely a divisive issue within the party as well. Yeah.
So it definitely isn't one of those constituency represented type issues. The same with Brexit. It's not the same for everyone. And I do agree with the point that it does undermine that representative function. However, there is definitely the argument that they aren't necessary when it comes to more divisive issues, such as immigration, such as healthcare, such as voting systems. I definitely do agree that that is a good point. And I agree with a voting system referendum, definitely 100%. I think that is one that we do need to introduce, because I didn't even think of that. I'm not going to lie. It's definitely one that we do need to introduce, because if we're voting people in, we should also be allowed to decide how we're voting them in a way that's reflective of the actual outcome, firstly, as first past the post really is not. And it should also be reflective of the people's voice as a whole. So I do agree with that point, definitely.
Well, we seem to have come to the end of the task and the end of this episode. So anyway, guys, thank you for watching today's episode of the Big Political Questions. As I said at the beginning, we like to debate these great issues of our time relating to the Edexcel specification of A-level politics. Obviously, we want to hear what your big political questions are. We'll certainly debate them. We can put perhaps this aside to go over your own issues.
Make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more, whether you're an aspiring student or someone who is just interested in the topics that we debate. And I suppose that's everything from us today.